I'm a Sierra Leonean, born in Sierra Leone, grew up in Sierra Leone, went to school there, just college, and graduated as a lawyer in Sierra Leone. And this was before the war. I had graduated and was in private practice of my profession. Then war came and torn everything apart. So basically,
how did that impact you, by the way? You talk about the war came. Again, for the camera, we're doing this sort of a history lesson. When was the war? Give us the dates.
Yeah, war started in Sierra Leone in 1991. And for several years, it was mainly affected the provincial parts of the country. And, you know, I grew up in Freetown. I was working in Freetown, which is capital. And so we were largely unaffected up until in 1997, May 1997 to be precise, when we got very directly affected by that conflict. And that was the year that there was a coup by members of the army who had until then been fighting against the rebels who had waged war. And so it sort of, you know, completely confused the whole situation. And then they formed a government which was very, very much opposed, and it created problems for many, many people. So people fled the country, and that was when I first left Sierra Leone. It affected work, it affected practice for the whole period that that government was in office. There was hardly any kind of activity, formal activity going on. So, you know, work, places closed down. There was some kind of disobedience, if you like, civil disobedience to some extent, yeah.
Now, did your family leave or just you leave?
My family leave. I just married then, and so myself and my dear wife left, and we went to Ghana. We were hoping to travel further on to the US, but for some reason we couldn't make it beyond Ghana, and so we stayed. And this was, we finally actually reluctantly left in August. The coup took place in May. And, you know, we sort of, hung out a bit, hoping that things would get better, but it got worse every day. And what happened is this government, this new junta government, who had until that time been fighting against the rebels, invited the rebels to join them in governance. So basically, for 6 years or so, these rebels had been, you know, I mean, they were everybody's enemy, if you like, because they had run the countryside completely down. They had killed people. They had displaced large, the population. And so by the time they got to Freetown, they were basically everybody's, everybody just wanted them dealt with. So the soldiers who had been fighting against them now stage a coup and invite them to be their brothers, and they formed a government. So rebels came into town, and that became a big issue, a big concern for everyone, the reason people left. And so, you know, we were in Ghana.
What year did you leave?
It was 97, that same year in August, where we stayed in Ghana for until October. It was about 3 months, a little over 3 months. Why we left Ghana in October of that year was because they had signed a peace accord in Conakry. They called it the Conakry Peace Accord, and it was that was an accord signed between the government that had been ousted, which was based in Conakry, neighboring Sierra Leone, and the junta's own power. The purpose, the effect of it was that they would hand over power peacefully in 6 months. So that gave hope to many who had fled. You know, we were running completely down and out, you know, and people wanted to come back to their livelihood. So we came back, trooped back in.
So did you start practicing? Were you a lawyer then?
Yes, indeed. I started off practicing with a firm. We were in civil commercial practice, actually, not criminal. Well, we did a little bit of criminal work, but it was civil commercial work, largely. I did to some extent some criminal work, and until we left, went to Ghana, came back. I continued on, and then the 6 months that we had been hoping would be the end of this terrible period did not really come to pass, because these guys showed no desire to leave, and they had to be forced out.
Yeah.
The government in exile had the support of the regional forces, ECOMOG soldiers who came in. This was about January of '98, the following year, and sort of forced them out of power. So that was the beginning of a new phase. So an ousted government coming back, and some semblance of normalcy in civilian life, and people, came back. We started again, but these guys never went far. They were ousted from Freetown, so they tactically withdrew and moved into the hinterland, the up country, and they now became rebels themselves, fighting alongside their brothers who were in the bush. So they taught them the tricks of
wow.
Yeah. So they were constantly putting pressure again on the population in Freetown. Freetown sits in a peninsula on the, in a very small enclave in the country, and there's only one main artery leading in and out of Freetown. Once that is cut off, it can be really a very serious situation for the residents. And that's where at that stage, it was probably half of the country's population living in Freetown. Population then, before the conflict, was about 5-point-something million. And as they overran the countryside during those years of war, many people were displaced and they moved into Freetown. So, by about '98, you had about half of the country's population living in Freetown. So military situation was really there once these guys moved up country. And that was the situation we were in '98. I came back from Ghana. We're trying to make ends meet, and it was not really a pretty situation. So for the rest of '98, it was the government, the reinstated government, with the support of foreign troops, was trying to find its feet. But it made what many people think was also a political mistake of its own, because they came in and managed to arrest some of the junta members who had been ousted, and they were mainly from the military. Some of them were not able to leave. They were arrested and were put on trial. There were several trials. All those who collaborated with them during that 9 month of misrule, as they called it. So it polarized the society. There were those who supported, to some extent, the rule of that junta. There are others who were completely opposed, but the majority was opposed to it. These trials went on within '98, and they were convicted, many of them senior officers, and there were executions. So that even drove a wedge further between, different groups in society. It built further the anger of the guys in the bush who were up country, and by January of '99, there was a big invasion of the city. So that's what and I think it's recorded widely in our history as the invasion of Freetown.
How did you react? You're now there, you're a practicing lawyer, January of '99, and all of a sudden all hell breaks loose.
Precisely. And it was really quite a difficult one, because I have to say that from about May of 1997, when that coup took place, through till January of this big invasion of the capital, there wasn't really much going on. Government was trying to find its feet. People were still displaced. A lot of educated, the elite had left, and some were finding it difficult to come back. So there was a huge displacement of the population. There was some amount of work going on, but it wasn't so normal. Life was not normal. Yeah. But we just managed to hang on. And I don't know, for some reason, for me personally, there was always the hope that we would get past this point. And that just kept me going until after the January invasion in 99, which was really, it was beyond description. The fortunate side for me was that I was living in a part of town which was not in the immediate path of the rebels and the former soldiers as they entered Freetown.
Right.
So by the time we were living in the western part of the city, and normally you would approach the city from the east, and so they had overrun many areas in the east, and they had caused a lot of mayhem, and the rest of it is all documented in history. That's it.
So what'd your wife say? She said, "Come on, let's get out of here."
Well, she had a job as well. Although we could have left. I think between us we sort of encouraged each other to try and see it out. There were other people who lived, so you sort of, my head of the senior partner in the chambers was there. I mean, he gave me a lot of. I do have a lot of inspiration, courage from him. I had two other colleagues who were in the firm. They left. They went to the U.S. They came here, the U.S. And so, but you had that hope every day that things would get better. So she had she had a job with the bank, Standard Chartered Bank, and we kept it going. It wasn't easy.
Yeah.
I finally made the decision to leave. Actually, after most of it was over. But then the aftermath of all of that there was less and less opportunity. There was less work to do. There was, at that stage, we already, as a country, had earned the image. We had carved an image for ourselves of being a war-torn, place where there's hardly anything going on, and so people were just leaving.
What was the court system like? Were they being affected by the politics?
The national courts. Yeah, it's an interesting question. The court was affected in a way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was this kind of situation where people who worked for the government chose either to keep on working or to just leave. And so if they left, didn't seem to be any sanction. The government, sitting government, didn't seem to have the muscle, didn't seem to have what it took to discipline anyone. So there were judges who left, for instance. So not all the courts were sitting. So what they managed to do was to have the few magistrates around to sit on small criminal cases, and a few judges who still stayed. Thought it was necessary to stay on and work. And those are the sort of people who were labeled as collaborators with the government. Yeah. So it became a problem for them as well. Actually, it was just not a pretty situation. Justice was not really dispensed to the level of fairness and impartiality as you would understand it.
When you were there in Freetown, did you get a sense of the involvement with Charles Taylor from Liberia? I mean, was that in the headlines? Was that, you kind of knew that was happening?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. When war started, right from the beginning in 91, I think everybody knew that this was a war that had been that had originated from Liberia, from across, because it started in a part of the country which is close to the border with Liberia, and as the war, kept on, we started getting reports about captured rebels who were interrogated, and they made it clear that they had come from Liberia. And nobody, even though at that stage Taylor was not president, but he was also conducting his own campaign in Liberia, mm-hmm. and there was clear evidence that he had a good relationship and was supporting, in fact, these rebels that had come from Liberia, and that kept on. So it was quite an open thing, and the press captured some of it. His statements and pronouncements were captured on radio and were broadcast over BBC, for instance. So there was no doubt that he had a hand in what was going on in Sierra Leone.
In America, we've watched the movie The Blood Diamonds. Again, for the camera, could you kind of place, was that the motivation, some of the motivation of Liberia's President Taylor to kind of come into Sierra Leone? Was it economic?
I would say, from having followed this conflict and having worked in a court that's dealt with so much of the evidence that has come out at this trial, I would say that it was not originally the motivation. Or even if there was that kind of motivation, it was very much masked, and you would not have considered that. It was probably peripheral, or perhaps you may say it was secondary, in the sense that they wanted to take territory, they wanted power, and then ultimately control resources and use resources to continue to keep them in power. So I would say originally power for the sake of power was what they wanted. But ultimately power enabling you to control resources and using those resources for whatever other motives was not far away from their thinking. So yes, in a sense, and no. If you look at it from a layman's position, you would think, they only wanted power. Because we were looking at the RUF, the rebels that came in, and what were their avowed goals for coming in and for fighting the government of the day. So they talked about corruption, they talked about nepotism, they talked about unemployment, and a lot of those things. The usual mantra that you get from those who are outside power and wanting to come in. So that was the sort of thing. But obviously, you should be able to read slightly beyond that to know that once you get power, you're in control of resources. And that became actually manifested not very long from the evidence now that we had when they captured Kono district. I think that was when their perception and their motives started changing.
Yeah.
Because once they captured Kono for the first time, which is the diamond, the bread basket at the time, because industry was almost nil in Sierra Leone, but the mining sector was what we relied on heavily. Once they captured Kono for the first time, I think it was in 92, 94 was when it was a big one. In 92 they tried and got a little foothold there and then moved out. In 94 was a big one. And they really got a taste of what diamonds would controlling diamonds would mean for their campaign. The story then, the script then changed.
Yeah. So we're going back to 99. Then at some point in 2001, the Special Court for Sierra Leone is created. How did you connect with the David Cranes of the world?
Okay. So as I was saying, in 99, when after this big invasion, all these guys in the bush came back into the city, and we then had the Lome Peace Accord. Eventually, it seemed like they had, a sway. The government was a government supported by, foreign forces, but didn't seem to be able to contain them. And so eventually they were forced to the negotiating table. They had peace in 99, Lome Peace Accord, and which eventually set the process in motion. Was basically the foundation document from which we eventually moved to all of these transition process. So once we had that, I left Sierra Leone and came to the UK and did postgraduate studies. it was for me the best thing I could do with my time then. So I left. My wife stayed. Then work. There was some semblance of normality at that stage now, and with the signing of the accord, there was some assurance, sufficient assurance, widely, that amongst international community that there's a will towards moving away from conflict now. So it was good enough to let her use my little money paid for myself and studied in the UK. And even at that stage, I was not focusing on international criminal law.
Right.
I'd come from a civil commercial background. So I did my studies, did 2 postgraduate degrees. One was in property law and another was in international commercial law. And then completed, came back to Freetown. Well, I was basically making the transition to Freetown when the court was set up. And I remember very much that I was in England when a colleague in Freetown contacted me and said, if you're interested, there's this court set up. Would you apply? And so he sent me the papers and I applied. And I had to send my application to New York because in January of, the court was set up in January of 2002. And David Crane and his team, the first team, Al White, and a few others had come to Freetown in summer of that year, about July. And so they were still building up. And this was about the same time that I was wanting to move from the UK to Freetown and got this application form. So I filled it. So their administrative setup was still based out in New York, sent the application there, and moved down to Freetown. So I was now thinking, I've really forgotten about them, thinking of starting, continuing on with practice. And then one day I got this call on the phone. It was the guy who was the first chief of prosecutions, Frank Fountain, I think. He didn't stay long, and said he wanted to know whether I was the person speaking. I said, yeah. And did I put in an application some time back? I said, yeah. He said, well, it's okay, available for an interview. And, that was it. The rest of it... The rest of it became, is the history that we're speaking of today.
Well, interestingly, did they feel like they needed, as part of the balance of the team, to have an individual who was lived it, understood the nature of Sierra Leone? Was that part of your role as?
I'm not so sure whether it had to do with a desire to have someone who would live through the conflict itself and had obviously I think they were pretty much hopeful that they would have somebody of that nature, but I don't think my application sort of stated that. Mm-hmm. I think what was more their focus was to have Sierra Leonean lawyers who were one experienced to some extent and had a level of education that would enable they would be sure could work with them and on this process. So and there were not too many colleagues of mine at the time who ventured into postgraduate studies. Sierra Leone, small jurisdiction, you finish. And we were among the first, the early crop of Sierra Leonean trained lawyers trained in the country. Prior to that, our lawyers were trained in the UK. So I'm among the first 4 that came out from our university. So we had not really moved beyond getting a law degree and a professional training certificate. So it wasn't really, in my view, that was not a primary intention or desire. However, once they realized that I had also lived through the period and had a hands-on kind of knowledge and experience of what happened, it became an asset.
So, at some point, you meet David Crane.
Yes. So when I got recruited in October of 2002, yes, indeed, I met Dave. Of course, he would have been informed. He would have At that stage, it was a small office, and not as many. I probably might have been the third or fourth Sierra Leonean recruited in his office. So the court is not fully set up yet. They were still recruiting, so he would have known who he was even before I met him personally. Yes, indeed. After I was recruited, I got introduced to him, and started working. Interesting, we were working from a building which much of Freetown had been run down, and there were appropriate and decent facilities to work from were not that many. So they had this big, nice house. It was huge, and part of it they used for their accommodation. Security was also a concern for them, so they lived there. And when we came to work in the lower part of the building, so yes, I met with Dave and all the others, and it was basically that was their home, and so we were walking into their home every day.
At some point, you have to go. The team has to sort out who's those most responsible to seek indictments against. Were you part of that conversation?
Yes, very much. So basically, we once we started, the effort initially was, where do you start? You need to get the evidence to start doing anything, and so the focus was on investigations, and so there were 3 teams set up initially. We called them task forces: Task Force 1, Task Force 2, Task Force 3, and they each corresponded to the key players in the conflict. Actually, the groups. There was a group called the RUF, the rebels that started the conflict. So they were Task Force 1. Mm-hmm. So if you were assigned to working in that group, investigating their case, you were Task Force 1 team. If you were assigned to the team that was investigating the case against the soldiers who staged that coup in 1997 and invited the rebels to join them, you were in Task Force 2. If you were working in the team that was investigating the civil defense forces, who once the coup had taken place, became a civil militia group that was supporting the reinstatement of the government, and also working alongside the foreign forces who came to help kick out the junta forces. And of course, in the process, they committed their own crimes. Then you were in the CDF, you were in Task Force, Task Force 2. It was Task Force 3 initially, but then we shrank 1 and 2, which was the rebels and the soldiers, into 1. The reason being that they at some stage merged when the soldiers took power and invited the rebels, and their cause became one cause. They basically fought together. They invaded Freetown together in 1991. And when you looked at the indictment period that we were focused on, we were excluding much of the period that the rebels had fought alone by themselves, which was from 91 to 96. And why was 96 the cutoff? Because in 96, November 96, I remember, was the eve of my wedding. They had a peace meeting in Abidjan, and that was the first one that they got. This was between the normal government, democratic government of the day at the time, and the rebels only. This was one of the good days yet, when the army was still fighting for the government and pushing the rebels out. So they had that peace agreement in Abidjan, which was not respected. Mm-hmm. So in determining the mandate of the court, the drafters, the government of Sierra Leone and the United Nations, they agreed that that period would be excluded. So the mandate actually started from 96, 30th of November 96. And I wedded my wife on the 1st of December.
There you go.
Right. So that was cut off. So that's the reason why when those two groups were always focused on as one, because from then on they were more or less fighting the same cause right until the end of the conflict.
And it's through that task force now, number one, through the RUF. That's where the Charles Taylor part comes in, right?
Precisely. Now you cannot talk of you cannot talk of Taylor's involvement in the war without considering how he helped those the rebels, and how eventually he sought to support the two forces once we went past the 96 and into he became president in 97 in Liberia, and how he tried to use his position and his resources and power to support them. So you cannot divorce him from their effort then. I mean, he got convicted of aiding and abetting them, the supplies, whatever the provision that he provided them. So that's how he fits in, yes.
I'm almost visualizing a room of which you actually have pictures of various potential indictees. Is that true?
Pictures, yes. Eventually, when you put a dossier or when you put a file together,
yeah,
you obviously
who are this group are we gonna want to try to indict?
Yeah, no, it was quite a, I mean, it's quite a complex process. On the one hand, you have a mandate that says, beg your pardon, try those who bear the greatest responsibility for the crimes committed. And on the other hand, you have, various groups. You have a period of time over which they fought, and you had various commanders in different locations. So, and the evidence was not like one that streamed, in one direction all the time. It was like at one period it was one commander that committed such horrific crimes in a location. At another time is another one in another location at a different period. So you're forced to, as I agree with you, put the names up as they come, and then walk through them. A question of balancing the evidence, balancing the weight of the evidence as you have it. The witnesses that the witnesses you speak with, what they say, how much of it, in terms of weight goes to support, the several guys that you see up there.
Yeah.
So it was like, fitting, pieces in a jigsaw. I mean, trying to see. So who gets the most before the pieces finish, then they become the one with the greatest responsibility. I mean, there was not enough pieces to go into all the holes there. So who gets enough is probably one you would consider. And the other question is, how high up were they? See, at the end of the day, also, we had to look at other modes, the modes of liability, command responsibility. If you were in command, you were, specifically, the statute says specifically that you cannot be excused simply because you were in some senior position and so on. So all of those were factored in determining who eventually we picked on, who we decided or determined. Well, we as a team would put that evidence together, make those determinations. But always you got a team leader. Initially, when these task forces were set up, I briefly worked as the team head. There was just a few of us in the CDF, the Task Force 2 team, until Jim came on. So for a couple of months, I think, I was the one sort of leading those efforts. But then Jim came on and took over.
So Jim was a task force?
Initially, he was a team leader, was a senior trial attorney kind of position, because the teams were all headed by a senior trial attorney. So he was the senior trial attorney for that team. There were others in the other teams, like I think Robert Petit was Central Attorney for the Task Force 1 group. And there, although the two Task Force 1 and 2 had been fused, there was still, to some extent, because we had 3 trials, eventually we kept them separate. But the evidence was fused because the witnesses they dealt with were more or less the same witnesses. Yeah. So there was also somebody who headed what should have been a Task Force 2.
Somebody had to make a call about the fact that they were going to have at least a sealed indictment against the head of state, Charles Taylor. Was that a difficult conversation?
Yeah, I think from a personal point of view, I think, and also I think perhaps weighing in from the views that I heard from within the court. Forget outside the court generally. But within the court, I think it was because I think obviously the prosecutor wears 2 hats. He wears his professional hat and wears the diplomatic one as well. And so when it comes to matters of politics and diplomacy, he's probably not bound to seek the opinion or advice of members of staff. So probably this was a strategy that he thought out with the more senior members of his office, but obviously at my level, we only got to know about it after the effort, after the request had been made, and the backlash that came with.
Yeah, I was just saying, were you surprised? I mean, especially in the you're living in the country, you're Sierra Leone, and you're close to the action. I don't know
whether surprise is the word. Perhaps yes, but I think I would have expected that a little more tact would have been applied. I think that was pretty a face-on kind of confrontation with those guys sitting in Accra. There was a meeting of ECOWAS leaders. Apparently, they were discussing Taylor's, his situation. Because there was increasing pressure on him back in his country. There was renewed fighting, and those rebels seemed to be getting the upper hand on him. And there were civilian casualties. And I think one of the things that these leaders were discussing there was, how do they, how do they move forward with this? And as they were sitting there, this call came. I think how it worked was in addition to the call, before the call, there was the prosecutor's request. It came in the form of request, I think, was sent to the Ghanaian embassy in Freetown, because that's where you. And then they, at the same time, transmitted the message to Ghana in Accra. I think while this meeting was going on, so simultaneously the message went out. Obviously, I think a little more tact would have been applied, or should have been out. The timing perhaps was.
Because he was served at a meeting. I mean,
that's right.
Indicted. I mean, the unsealing of the indictment.
Well, the thing is, I'm sorry. The thing is, the effect obviously was the indictment becoming public now. Publicly now. Yeah. I think obviously Taylor was under a hunch, always, that he was not going to be left. He knew his tracks. He knew what he had done. He had even sought in the early stages to fight off, the court's efforts to indict him. So I mean, he knew his tracks very well. So there's no question about him. It was not formal, but there was no question about him knowing, that somehow, someday, we're coming after him.
Were there other heads of state who were part of that? I mean, we were focusing on Taylor now.
Right.
Were there other heads of states of other African countries that may have been complicit? that might have been considered
in complicit in all of. Well, clearly he had an embargo at some point imposed on importation of arms into Liberia, and so you would wonder where were those arms coming from that still came in. So you clearly would have to. You don't have to go. You don't have to be some. You would be a dumb whatever to not know.
Well, not a rocket scientist.
Exactly. So yeah, clearly, and when I came to work with the court, it became very clear that Burkina Faso was one of those countries that was really complicit in all of this, and Libya. Everybody knew Libya was, because when we learned about the rebels, as I said earlier. We all heard about them coming from Liberia, but also that they had links with Libya, that they had gone there for training. That was pretty much openly known in Freetown. But the extent to which, for instance, Burkina Faso was involved, and perhaps to some extent maybe Ivory Coast, but not always with the knowledge and intention of the leaders there,
right.
And to the extent that they used Ivory Coast as a territory was perhaps not much known. I came to understand a lot of the intricacies and complexities of this when I worked on the cases and saw the evidence.
Yeah, but clearly there was a choice that David had to make.
Oh yeah, indeed, and I talk about tact here, not simply because the politicians were the ones who sort of hit back. I mean, they didn't like it, and so that's the difficulty with his position, because he's on the one hand he's not pleasing anybody politically. He has no business and no reason to please anyone.
Yeah.
And so he did what was right, as a prosecutor. At some stage, that indictment had to be disclosed. I didn't like it that it was being disclosed in that high-level meeting in which they were seated. So what I'm saying is perhaps he might have had a few friends among the leaders who friends as in who you needed the cooperation of states. You need cooperation. Right. If you don't get the cooperation of states, there are things that you are not able to do easily. So my feeling is that if you need that cooperation, you don't do too much to anger some people.
Yeah.
So that's. But clearly, the indictment had to be disclosed at some stage,
yeah.
And that was anything like it. Obviously,
yeah.
I thought it was a slap in the face. So.
Did David come back after? I mean, all because there was when he was indicted, became public. He then went to was it Nigeria? Where did he go?
Tell her. He eventually, that's right. Eventually, he I don't know how true this was, but in that meeting, they were discussing his exit from power. And indeed, though, shortly after that, this was in May, in August, I think, either because of the agreements that they made there in that meeting, or the pressure, the mounting pressure, which continued until in August. But he eventually left and went to Nigeria. He was given certain guarantees that he would be safe and be protected by the president of Nigeria. And that was backed by other African leaders too. I think Thabo Mbeki of South Africa was there, and I don't remember who. I don't think it was a Ghanaian one, but there were three of them who agreed, Nigeria, South Africa, I guess it was Ghana, that he would be protected. So on that basis, he left, gave up power, and moved to Nigeria.
A couple of years ago, at this event, I had a chance to interview David, Desmond, Stephen, and Brenda. The case had, the sentencing had been given. There were some appeals, but basically the case was over. and for the first time, I had a chance to go through the trial,
Okay.
which was terrific. Again, historically, David, with the indictment, the politics behind that, and then Desmond had to work the politics of getting him extradited.
That's right.
Were you involved in that process at all? Do you remember much about that?
Yes, in a way. Yeah. I mean, there was this was big international politics now.
Mm-hmm.
So Taylor is sitting in Nigeria. These heads of state had assured him of his protection. The court, we were finishing the trial. I think we had completed the CDF case, and one of the key guys in the CDF, Inga Norman, died before judgment. And there was all this talk around that, what has the court achieved really in terms of going after those who bear the greatest responsibility? So the question was, do we have any more persons to look to? There's not as many. There were not many others, and those we had were middle-level players. So it was, in a wider public opinion kind of sense, there was some pressure on us to do something and give the court, give a little more meaning to what the court has achieved. Obviously, Taylor, with his indictment still lying there open, was an obvious option, obvious choice, and there was Desmond had to do quite a lot. It's quite a complex scenario, but first. The government, it could not be achieved without the cooperation of leaders in these countries, some of these countries. Obasanjo was not the one who would be willing to give Taylor up easily. The new president of Liberia then, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, she didn't want anything to do with this process if she could manage it. So, and then we had an ECOMOG force, a UN force based in Liberia, UNIOSIL, I think, which had powers of arrest, which could do things that the government of the day may not feel able or be willing to do. So I think we got Desmond, first of all, tried to get a United Nations Security Council resolution. Something that gave the authority to UNIOSIL that should Taylor be found on Liberian soil, he should be arrested. So they had that. So that was done and dusted and put somewhere. It was a kind of mechanical process. And then there was all of the pressure starting to build. And I think Obasanjo, I'm just moving things up really fast. Obasanjo had to make a visit to the US. It was President Bush he was coming to see. And there was, so as we had been piling the pressure on him releasing Taylor, so there's all this, during that period, we're now piling pressure, doing what we could to get him. Mm-hmm. So he is not wanting to do anything. He's not budging. The pressure is mounting. We hear he gets a couple of meetings with Taylor. I think probably hinting at the possibility that he may have to give him up. So anyway, he wants to make this visit to US. And he travels. Taylor is now somehow informed by Obasanjo that, things may have to happen. He is at the doorstep of the White House. And President Bush, said, you will not come in until you have complied with, certain demands that are being made of you in terms of, fighting international justice. So you got to let that guy go. Otherwise, it was big embarrassment for continental Nigeria. The president is at the doorstep, White House, and not let in. So he finally sends back and says, go for it, Taylor. I think he personally told him, go for it. And Taylor is going for it.
You mean escaping?
That's right. Taylor I think he probably had told him that before he left. Taylor is now on his way going. He's disappeared from the radar for like 12 hours. Nobody knows what is happening where he is. And Obasanjo is waiting at the doorsteps here. Bush says, you got to get that guy, otherwise you don't come in. So he sends back and says, arrest Taylor wherever he is. So in a short period, he tells Taylor, go, and then he countermands that by ordering his arrest. So by the time that order comes, Taylor is at the border in Liberia, almost getting across to Cameroon. He already had, improvised himself with a lot of cash and whatever he could manage. And so they arrested him there. It was a bit confusing because from what we gather, based on the earlier tip-off, he was moving actually with Nigerian officers who were helping him out. And now he gets to the border and he's really arrested by other officers. So it's a conflicting situation.
So the Nigerians have arrested him and the Cameroons too, or no?
He was at the border to go into Cameroon. He wasn't Nigerian. I don't think the Cameroonians would have allowed Nigerians to arrest him there.
Yeah. Ah.
So now he is arrested by Nigerian officers at the border with a lot of cash, which never shows up in anywhere. We never got that. And so in court there was some argument about how much money it was. Yeah. I think officially said it was about $500,000, and in court they tried to downplay it or something, but that was not the focus of our trial. Anyway, so he gets arrested. At this stage, UNIOSIL had that mandate to arrest him if he lands in Liberia. Nigeria says, well, we cannot hand him over to the court, but we send him back to his country.
Oh, that's right. Back in Liberia.
Yeah, Ellen Sirleaf says, I don't want anything to do with this. So we have UNIOSIL, it's a UN body, sitting there waiting for his arrival. He lands, he's flown to Liberia, and as he's being flown out, the White House opens the door for Obasanjo. His visit goes on. So as he's been flown out, the guys, it's 2 hours. UNIOSIL is ready in Liberia. At the airport, he's formally arrested.
In Liberia?
And our guys are also there because we had mandate to arrest him too. I'm sorry. So his indictment and everything is read to him. The UNIOSIL arrested him on the basis of that UN resolution, handed him over to the special court because that's what the resolution said, to hand over to us. So our guys were there, formal arrest, and he's put on a flight. And we were all in Freetown that evening waiting his arrival. The whole of Sierra Leone, basically.
Wow. So as was you were there.
Yeah, I was. And then and then I happened to then be pulled into the team that made it to court even on the first day of his appearance.
So you'd never met him before, never saw him before. No. So that day, did you?
No, not at all. Not before closest I came to him was on the first day he appeared for his initial appearance in court in Freetown.
Was Freetown ecstatic? Was there a celebration?
It was perhaps ecstatic is understating it. Ah. But indeed, it was beyond words describing the feeling. Everywhere. I mean, everybody knew that this helicopter would fly in any time. The court compound was full. I mean, when I say everywhere, all across town. It was basically the talk of the country. So he lands. So it was the biggest, we call it the biggest catch. Yeah.
So then he's obviously brought into court, makes an appearance, pleads not guilty, and the case proceeds.
That's right.
And you uniquely were involved with all 4 prosecutors.
That's right.
So maybe you should pause for a second. They're all different people.
Yes.
Give me a kind of a description of. I'm going to go through all four of them. David, as you worked with him, how would you describe him?
Practical, pragmatic, hands-on kind of person, and keeping close, really close with his teams. So, for instance, even though he would be kept away, busy with either diplomatic or even his professional court work, he would make it on a Friday. Every Friday, he initiated this idea of we called it all hands meeting, to have a meeting of all the members of his office, the prosecutor's office, investigators, prosecutors, and so sort of update us on things and sort of help connect. This is in addition of obviously to the team sectoral meetings that he would have in the course of the week, but this is like having everyone on board. And so he always had that close connection. It was a deep tradition that he left, which all the others took on. So he initiated that. So he always wanted to connect well with staff.
At some point, he leaves. Why? Do you know why he left? Was it something where he just had done what he wanted to do and moved on?
I guess so, because the court was set up initially to run only for a certain time period. Quite naively, many thought that this was a court that would run only for a short period. So 3 years was the time frame that they said that the court would last. And so my thinking is that not only him, but many others who came had sort of worked out, that this would be how much they would put in terms of their own effort to the court's work. But he obviously must have felt accomplished by what he had done, in addition to, wanting to only do that amount of time.
So during his time period, everybody who was to be indicted had been brought into court except for Charles Taylor.
Yes, by the time he left, yes. Everybody except for those who were either not found or had died before being indicted. But everybody else who had to be tried, who went on trial eventually, except Charles Taylor had seen that day in court.
So David leaves. What's the process of selecting Desmond, and what was he like?
Desmond was the deputy prosecutor with David.
So he was already there?
He was already there.
Okay.
And the way it worked was the prosecutor was appointed by the Secretary General, and the deputy prosecutor was appointed by the government of Sierra Leone, because the court is formed by an agreement between the two entities. So being the deputy prosecutor sitting there made him obviously an obvious choice. And this is the position of prosecutor is one that comes by appointment, obviously, with consultation between the two, the government and the UN. So he got it.
Desmond's been here a few times. I've interviewed him like this, and what a great English accent. He's
very
out
much
of central casting. But what was he like as a chief prosecutor?
Again, following closely in the footsteps of David, they had worked together. They started. They came in together, more or less. So it was easy to keep that tradition. It was sort of natural to keep that tradition. So that you would hardly sense any, difference in approach or any difference in style. There's the connection with the staff members at all cadres continued. Those meetings on Fridays continued. And Desmond, it seemed to me like he wanted to be in the courtroom more than David. That's what it seemed to me. David was in the courtroom mostly for those opening events, the opening statements, which Desmond also did. But it seemed like Desmond just probably wanted more to be in a courtroom.
And that's part of his background in England. I mean,
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I love his just style. It just
he's got his quintessence English Englishman, right? Yeah.
Fantastic.
And it's quite he's got so much fun and a lot of humor.
Exactly. But then Desmond too. He was during the time where he worked the politics, however it worked, of getting Taylor extradited. Now he's in the court. Was he there at the beginning of the trial? Well, of course, that trial, the Taylor trial, wasn't that moved? It
was moved to The Hague. Yeah. Now Desmond finished. He finished with, once we had Taylor in, Desmond was done. I think he only did a year.
Okay.
He only did a year. Apparently, maybe I can't be 100% on this, but maybe to have a sense of continuity for 1 year only, and then I think he was, it was quite challenging for non-Sierra Leoneans, to have gone down there in the environment, the work environment, the work situation was not all that easy. I mean, there was a lot of challenge with power. There was a lot of challenge with social living, with amenities and things like that. So if you had family and you used to all the the nice things and luxuries here, it was quite a sacrifice that many were making. So it was understandable that people only wanted to stay for a short period and come back to what they used to, their life they used to. So I think he probably just committed to 1 year and then left.
And then Stephen came on.
Yes.
Was Stephen on the court in the staff, or did he come out from the outside?
He came from outside.
Yeah.
He came from Rwanda.
That's right.
When he came, there were others who wanted the position, but he got it from outside. He was an outsider.
Did he change things? Was there a policy change in the office? Could you sense it?
I thought he worked a little more with his close senior associates than coming down at the level of all the cadres, as he continued on with the traditions of the Friday thing, for instance. But I sense that and probably because of the fact that he needed to keep himself abreast more with the culture, the ethos within the office, and you had a large number of Sierra Leoneans. It's not, and so perhaps one of the reasons why he initially he connected himself more with the more senior, the senior trial attorneys, for instance. But also the other thing is, I can say a lot more about Stephen was because we moved about the time he was coming in, and he was based in Freetown. We were moving up to The Hague. I was moving up to The Hague, and that was in 2007. And at that stage, Brenda was my the authority, senior most authority that I related to directly, and so we would see Stephen up in The Hague now and again, and not as many times. So it was Brenda mostly until she eventually succeeded him as prosecutor. So so those years that he served and he was in Freetown, it was not always easy for me to be able to speak, to in terms of how you related with staff.
So it's sort of Stephen, Brenda, and then you? Is that
Well, I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not a.
Yeah.
I have not become a chief prosecutor.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean,
You reported to Brenda.
Yes. Oh, yeah. In terms of
Yeah.
hierarchy, yeah. I mean, there was also Nick. When Nick joined the team, he was senior to me as well. So there was some hierarchy.
Oh, sure.
I was still not.
Now, did Stephen do the opening statement on Taylor?
Yes, and I shared the platform with him on that day.
Oh, did you?
Yes, right.
What a thrill that must have been.
Very much. It was.
Well, talk about that. So this is the biggest defendant of the trial.
That's right.
You're at The Hague, and he probably does a few statements and then turns it to you?
That's right. And actually he did the lion's share of it, but he turned it over to me. I did my own bit and turned it over to him again, and he finished it up. So he came in twice, and I was sort of sandwiched in the middle.
And the principal reason, I'm sure there are many reasons, but because you were Sierra Leonean, that he wanted to make that statement, essentially?
Yes, in a sense, because if you put that in context, that would be the conclusion straight away. I say context because when we had starting with the very first one of those opening statements we had back in Freetown, the CDF case, the opening was done by David Crane, he was then the prosecutor, and Joseph Kamara, who was in the CDF team. So the CDF team, as was composed, was Jim Johnson, Joseph Kamara, and then myself, before we had others who also became more senior to me. But initially that was that hierarchy. And so first one was Crane and Joseph, CDF. Then we had the RUF. Again, Crane was prosecutor, so Crane and...
Oh, excuse me. Sorry.
So again, we had Crane and Abdul Tijan Kool, a Sierra Leonean who worked with us. He now works for Open Society in West Africa. And then for the AFRC, the soldiers, what would have been TF2, Task Force 2, it was again David Crane because he was still prosecutor. And Boitia Stevens, she's Sierra Leonean attorney, went to school here in the US, had worked in the Rwanda Tribunal and had some bit of experience when she joined us. So at that stage, those were the trials that were started in Freetown, and that was it. So if you put me now in the context of a Sierra Leonean sharing the podium with Stephen Rapp, it fits. But there was also this point about Brenda, who headed the team, being suddenly, having suddenly to travel back home. Something happened, and so she had to urgently travel back home. And in fact, I remember that I was up in The Hague. At this stage, we were moving gradually. The team was moving gradually up in The Hague, and they were in Freetown, and I was trying to set up in The Hague when that had happened. Brenda left, and I was called from Freetown and informed that Brenda suddenly had to leave, and so I'd been nominated to share. So it was probably a mix of both. So I keep asking myself, would it have been the same if Brenda had stayed, because she'd worked so much on the case, and would it have been herself and me, or would it have been her and Stephen? But anyway.
So you're before the court. What's going through your head? You're there. There's Charles Taylor. You've a chance to make an opening statement.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great opportunity. You quickly, after all the realization that you'll be part of history in that big moment. You have the sobering, your soberness of considering what has to go into that, what you have to do, what preparations you have to make, and how you're going to make it really, make yourself do it right that day. So yeah, so on the one hand, there's that excitement, there's that looking forward to this big day, and on the other hand, fighting to make sure that you do it right. So yeah, but I got a lot of support from the team, because these are complex cases, and it's not one person working on them. And as much the prosecutor, Stephen, had, we had a lot of support, to the point where if you wrote something out, you had to share it and have them scrutinize it, and by the time it gets back to you, it is not, you may not recognize it as your work.
I know the feeling.
That's
yeah.
right. So eventually, we put it all together. It was segmented, my own portion and Steve's portion, and so unfortunately, on the day, the glamour of it, as it were, that we were looking for, was stolen from us to some extent. As you may be aware, Taylor did not show up in court that day, and
That's right.
So that in a sense took away from, the big show that.
Yeah.
For me, but still, there was all of those. The decision for Taylor not to show up was, I think, a very late one. So, and all those invitations had been sent out, and the gallery was full. There was diplomats, there was prosecutors, there was the press, and CNN was giving us coverage for, I think, first 30 minutes or so. All of this was being transmitted live in Freetown, and the courthouse in Freetown was just. So, the thought of, me standing there and the world seeing me, and it was just...
What a thrill. Well, and you worked very hard for that.
Yeah.
And probably that attention ranked right up there when Naomi Campbell came.
Right.
Do you remember that?
I remember that. Unfortunately, we seem to be remembered more because, a superstar, a supermodel came to the trial, rather than, for Taylor, we were obviously remembered a lot. But after Taylor, all of that, all of the, the memory and the thought that we were there had faded, and the interest had waned, and, not until Naomi Campbell showed up on the witness stand. Suddenly cut, we got in the buzz again of excitement and activity. Indeed, that was another high moment for us as a court. But I think that was, I didn't feature as much in terms of being one who was in the limelight as Brenda was. Of course, she cross-examined Naomi, and Nick also did cross-examination of other witnesses that were connected with the Naomi incident. So it was not so much in the limelight, but of course we were all, justice was glamorized in that sense. All those paparazzi photographers around, and it was nice again to be in the glare of all those events. Yeah.
Well, and Jim's talked about it, and Brenda's talked about it, and yes, it is brought up, and yes, it distracted perhaps from the actual trial a little bit, but it brought the attention of the world to the fact there was a trial and what was going on. So to that extent, it was all positive.
Yeah, indeed. It was helpful. For me, it was not just that. It was also the fact that the issue of diamonds was again, brought to the fore. And, Taylor's motive was clearly exposed. The fact that he would travel to South Africa with uncut diamonds and make a gift of some of those. We don't even know how many pieces, and what the value was to somebody he admired, I mean, and this is out of the sweat and blood of people in the mines who were subjected to all kinds of inhuman treatment.
Yeah.
So I mean, it brought the world's attention not just to the fact that there was this trial generally going on, but to the reality, in fact, that what we had been saying all along about Taylor's motive and about diamonds, was not out of context at all.
Always a curiosity. I don't think I've ever asked. How did you know about it? How did it come to your attention that happened?
I don't know whether I should really speak about that directly, but actually started with me and the team coming up with intelligence that I got.
Yeah.
And I think I just limited to that. But I was in Geneva, and it was a private visit. And then I came by this intelligence. And as soon as I got back, it was a weekend visit. And as soon as I got back, we reviewed it. I told them all that I had, and we reviewed it. And we suddenly realized that we were sitting on something really big. And we started, and so Nick took quite a lead in that. I remember that I was asked to go back with Nick on the investigation mission there, and I thought it was perhaps best not to, because the source was not very comfortable that any of this would come out, and a finger pointing to him. It would have been obvious that it was a he. So I declined to go on that mission. But yeah, that's how it started.
Wow. So the trial then moves its way where Stephen leaves, and Brenda comes back from her leave of absence.
Yeah.
Now was that just a smooth transition there, or did she have to go through an appointment, separate appointment process?
Yes, indeed. It's always an appointment. It always has to be. By the time Stephen came on, we had Joseph Camara as the deputy prosecutor. And remember that these are appointed positions. And the deputy prosecutor's position, according to the agreement, is one done by the government of Sierra Leone. So in spite of the fact that Joseph had worked, for instance, with Jim, under Jim in the hierarchy, he now got appointed by a political process. So he becomes the deputy prosecutor. And also by reason of that, he's above even Brenda, within the court hierarchy. However, it was clear that Brenda, at that stage, the other trials were almost done. They were either at an appeals stage or they were completely done with. And there was not a whole lot going on in Freetown. And the main activity that was moving the court on was the Taylor trial in The Hague. And everybody recognized that, and Brenda's position became very central to what the court was doing. So when Stephen left, it became a question of who fills that position. So Joseph, was it going to be by the sort of process where Desmond had been appointed, from deputy prosecutor, or was it going to be that they would look to other things, regardless of the fact that Joseph had been there as deputy? And I think they did, and so Brenda got appointed over Joseph, and yeah. So
did that cause any political problem with Joseph not being appointed?
No, as far as I know, there's nothing. I think it was a seamless process, and I think they both understood. I remember that we had these discussions a little. I remember that Brenda had a discussion with me. I was in her team when we were
sure.
And it was along the lines of because I'm Sierra Leonean, Joseph is Sierra Leonean, and Joseph is deputy prosecutor, So so that we don't have a situation where it seems like we're we're doing a national kind of effort only. So we had sort of an open discussion about it, and then it was not a question of asking my support as such, but it was just generally discussing how important it is to maintain openness in these sort of situations. And I think Joseph also understood it, because we had been close together on the team, on the Taylor team, and he was senior to me, and he had moved on. So, but we would have those sort of casual moments, and we would chat a bit. So I think there was everybody kept an open mind about it, and I think in the end, the better of the two candidates was appointed.
Yeah.
In terms of suitability to the court's work at that time.
Right.
Yeah, because Brenda was the one sitting at the helm of things in terms of all the activity, the main activity of the court. Right. Yeah, so it was, and also in terms of experience, I had no doubt that she would be the candidate to be appointed. In terms of experience and all that. So, yeah.
So Brenda becomes the chief prosecutor. She continues on with the Taylor case, does the closing. I mean, she's the closing piece of the Taylor case.
That's right, yeah.
Was there any doubt in your mind that he would be convicted? Until you know it, you never know until you know. But
yeah.
But
yeah, within me, I was pretty much convinced. I mean, there were moments when you would have those questions, those doubtful moments. I mean, the sort of defense that the Taylor's defense mounted, the sort of case that they mounted in defense, the sort of way they sought to, undermine, if you like, or sort of raise questions about the evidence we put forward. There's no question about the fact that evidence was solid and was more than what was required to send Taylor down. There was no question about that. But number one, as I said, they really mastered the trade, and did not they did not leave any trick in the book within the rules, of course, that would send doubts or questions about, for instance, whether it had to do with the credibility of a witness, or about a storyline and that sort of thing. So when you looked at that, plus there were elements in the public who were playing up some of the defense storylines and sort of giving those storylines undue amount of prominence, such that you are now beginning to have, in the court of public opinion, a reasonable feeling of doubt about the evidence which we had put forward. But I never had any doubt in my mind that we had put forward, really great evidence, sufficient enough, measuring to the threshold of beyond reasonable doubt, and even beyond that, if we had the higher threshold to meet, to send Taylor down. I never really had that. I remember that. Within the team, we all were similarly of that view. But again, you would not rest until you saw it, delivered, exactly as.
So you were in the courtroom that day.
I was, yes.
And they were starting to read the opinion.
Yeah, that's right.
The verdict. And were you nervous at all? I mean, you're listening. I'm just trying to think of the emotions, because you don't know. They don't hand you the copy.
No, not at all. That's right, exactly.
So you're listening.
So yeah, we're all listening. Everybody's sitting there. You know, I mean, you have to train yourself for that moment, because we're talking here of a process which had gone on for 2006 when Taylor was arrested, and putting at that moment. This is the reflection. This is what it comes down to. Is this all been a wasted time?
Yeah.
So 2006, it's all my reflection now is going back to that first day when I walked into the courtroom with Desmond da Silva, Staker, what's his first name? Dr. Staker, Brenda Hollis, Joseph Kamara, myself, and Jim Johnson. There were 6 of us. It was the first time. We had done a little bit of work before that, but I put in perspective all the effort since then to this was December. This was May, when was this now? May or so? No, April 20. I don't remember the date now. So putting all that into perspective, is this going to be what a day that we will vindicate us or what? But we learn to manage our concerns, our I don't know what you may call it.
Your emotions.
Our emotions, we learn to manage them. That morning, I remember that we had all former prosecutors who had traveled far and wide, and we had a sort of family gathering just before we went into the courtroom, photographs, and that helped to calm the nerves. Coffee, croissant.
Right.
So, it was a great atmosphere. By the time we moved into the courtroom, it wasn't, and it was, we were all self-assured that we had done a great job. So patting each other on the back, that sort of thing. Yeah. We went into that courtroom very much positive about what the outcome would be. So personally, I reflected on all of that effort, but I was still, we had reassured ourselves sufficiently and came out.
Well, and at some point they say they find him guilty of. So when they say the term "found guilty," did your eyes glance at other people?
Well,
or did you have a stone face the whole time?
You had to keep it straight. Any show of emotion would have to be perhaps outside of, not in that context, not in that situation. And don't forget that as prosecutors, we're not there to persecute. We're not there to get a conviction at all costs. We could live with whatever the outcome was, as long as we had put, we have put the best evidence forward. We've used the best of our ability and the resources available to us to get that evidence out and put it in court. So so it could have been the other way, but if it comes out the way you're expecting, you at least you should be a little muted in your in the way you celebrate your victory. Actually,
did you guys go out afterwards and have a toast? Or?
My wife was in Freetown then, and they were following it all, and I got a call immediately after, and it was all everywhere. I got calls and friends and family, those who knew that I was on the case and I was seated in court that day. It was. We came back. After the decision read out, we came back to the office, and there was a moment to blow out a bit.
High five.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then we had dinner that evening with all these former prosecutors, investigators who had come. It was quite a big, and that was the real celebration.
Great.
Because we were letting down.
Yeah,
the hairs down. Now we, having whatever they wanted, the big meal, and it wasn't in a restaurant, an African restaurant. It was a great evening.
That's fantastic. Well, and then of course, then it gets to the sentencing part of it, and I know that Jim has shared with me Taylor's during the sentencing gets up and does speaks to the court and calls out, David. Jim Johnson, Brenda Hollis.
That's right.
And there's a movie goes right to Jim.
That's right.
I play it all the time.
Right, yeah.
This is the guy right here, called out by Charles Taylor.
Yeah. His defense. They've always had this thing about the court not being independent, and the idea that the view that the court is being subject to some control by bigger powers, specifically the U.S., they say. And so him, Taylor, and his team have always pointed to all the Americans on the prosecution side as agents of America, basically. And so the independence was not something that the court should tolerate, that sort of thing. So, so yeah, I wasn't surprised. They had filed motions before that. They hadn't gone so extensive in naming others, but specifically named David Quinn in one of their motions before, one or two of the motions before, as somebody who was not independent and was subject to some control. So I wasn't surprised. That's again fitting into a storyline. One of their, as I said, they did not leave any trick in the book within the rules that they would throw at us. Yeah, so I was really surprised.
So he was sentenced to 50 years. He's serving it now in Britain.
That's right.
And you're at the residual special court.
Can I interrupt? I got brunch with David Crane at 12:30. Actually.
So when?
It's 12:30.
Well, what time is it now?
We're just going on. It's 12:20 now.
Yeah, it's 12. Oh my gosh.
Have you got a number for him, David?
David, I don't know. Do you want to just you want to call quits now? I'm not alone to attend the brunch. Well, we could just let's do 5 minutes. I want to.
Okay.
Just now that you're at the residual special court of Sierra Leone. And now everything's sort of wrapped up. You're at this legacy part.
That's right.
You're at the legacy. And what is the legacy? I mean, if you had to kind of recap and say, all right, we've been in 2002 to 2013 was the actual Sierra Leone Tribunal. What's, as the spokesperson for the legacy court, residual court, what is the legacy?
Well, if you wanted to look at what is the court's legacy, you have to first, in my view, go to what the court was set up to do, and what did it achieve, and if it achieved that, how has that impacted the society, the community, those for whom the court was set up to sort of achieve justice. So basically we had this mandate to prosecute those who bore the greatest responsibility for the crimes in Sierra Leone, and obviously to as an institution to bring accountability for the crimes committed there. But in addition to that, we always talked about helping to restore the rule of law, to end impunity and help to not wholly reinstate the rule of law, because that was just a big wide project that it's not really a mandate. But we always had talked about it, and in the agreement and in other documents relating to the court, and in pronouncements by the president, successive presidents of the court, we've always talked about helping to restore the rule of law. So if you look at those as the mandate, and those are the other objectives that the court was set out to do, and you look at primarily in terms of prosecuting those who bear the greatest responsibility, you have to weigh, did we get them? Did we look at the key persons who would in any case say that they're the ones who were responsible for all these crimes, and did we bring them to account for those crimes? I'm looking here I'm looking at this question, the legacy issue, from a prosecutorial point of view first, and then the wider issue would be the ending impunity, and the other one would be restoration of helping to restore the rule of law. So those would be wider in the wider sense in which one could look at what the legacy of the court is, not solely from a prosecutorial point of view. But if it was only from a prosecutorial point of view, you look at strictly the mandate. And I want to say that we completed those, and I don't think it's even a value judgment as to whether the ones we tried, the ones we arrested, tried and prosecuted and got convicted were not key players. Indeed, when you look at the hierarchy and you look at all those whom we indicted, all 13 of them had key positions and they actually had a hand, including Taylor. So there's no question about that. So what is that? Is that legacy? Well, we were a judicial institution set up to bring accountability for crimes committed. So we did that. So we, in that process, by doing that, we have sort of left behind a sense of among the within the country and among the people that you have to account for your actions. Impunity is not something that has a place in that society. Not forgetting that we had a TRC process that was set up and was running alongside the court at the same time, which was a transitional justice mechanism in a sense, but it didn't have the components of accountability.
Right.
So you could clearly see that it was necessary to go one step further to bring persons responsible to account. If we had left it at the TRC alone, there would not have been perhaps a sense of impunity, the sense that we were driving where impunity may not have been something that would have been left as a legacy. Right. So we in that sense, yes, by achieving what we did, we drove in the sense, the feeling, the idea that impunity is not something that we could we will tolerate. The question of whether we contributed towards restoring the rule of law is one that is wider, but it has some of its bearing in issues like the institutions of state, how they function, and how did we impact those institutions. It can only be limited because we're a justice institution, and so you look at what impact did we make in court structure, court proceedings locally. What impact did we make in building capacity in criminal trial work at the domestic level? What impact did we make by the examples we showed? What impact did we make in helping the national system to really stand up on its own? Because justice delivery is only one small component of restoration of the rule of law, basically. So I'm speaking only of that component.
Right. And
so the question of did we make much of an impact in those areas? I would say we tried, and still the jury is probably still out there, because you look at the country, you look at the depth to which the country had gone in terms of the dysfunctioning of its structures and systems in justice and in other areas was really quite profound, quite deep, and we may not have done enough. But I think the fact that we helped to build capacity, all those Sierra Leoneans who worked in the court and across several sectors, of course, within Office of Prosecutor, as prosecutors, as investigators, second police officers seconded to the court, some judges, Sierra Leonean judges, we all took so much from the court. I joined the court not from criminal practice background, let alone an international criminal justice background. So, and look at where I am today. And if I go back, I'm going to obviously bring along to them that experience, like my other colleagues who have gone in I've done. Joseph Kamara, I can count quite a number of them. Finn, he's a judge in the Court of Appeal now. Reginald Finn, he came after me and he worked in one of trials in Freetown. Meata Samba, I can go on naming them. She also sits as a judge now. So you cannot dispute the fact that the experience that they got from the court is obviously going to be applied in what they do day to day. Many other areas are still open to, be supported, but it was not primarily what the court was set up to do. So we've done what we could, and if by chance some of that is robbed off the justice machinery in Sierra Leone, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
You're amazing. This has got to be one of the most. I've done almost 100 of these, and this is the most informative one I've ever had. You've been great. You pieced in all of the missing links because you lived it.
Right.
Does it strike you that you're the guy that literally went through the entire history of the court?
Yeah, it is. It is. Sometimes I don't quite realize how much of a resource I am to the history and the basically history of the court and to people who wants to enrich their knowledge about what the court did. I sometimes don't realize it myself until it's pointed out to me, like you're doing now. It's like things I've done in my day-to-day life over these years, and I do not, personally, I am not, I'm a very humble person. And, I get by and do the things that I have to do day to day. And, sometimes it hardly comes back to me that, what I'm doing is being part of a history-making process that others look at and admire so much.
Well, I'm one of your fans. This is fantastic.